Alright, what's good YouTube? Again, it has been a minute since I was last active on the channel, but it is time to re-up, and of course, in the meantime, we have gone through the bulk of Golden Swing and February Indoor Hardcourt season. And of course, even within these parts of the season, we have had some very interesting revelations and takeaways that could have some longer lasting impact, and I want to talk about them today. But real quick, let's just get it out of the way. If you end up making it through this video and enjoying it, it would be much appreciated if you could drop a like. This helps the video perform much better in YouTube's algorithm, and also it would be much appreciated if you could subscribe to the channel if you're not already. I've made it a goal of mine this year to try and get to 1,000 subs. Let's see if we can make it happen. And without further ado, let's get into the video. So first and foremost, obviously the last 2 weeks have seen the return of Carlos Alcaraz, and immediately, his presence, just such a jolt in the arm for the sport and the Golden Swing. Great entertainment over those 2 weeks in Buenos Aires and Rio, and I think really smart for Alcaraz to kind of dip his toes in the shallow end early on, get his feet underneath him. Easy to forget that since winning the US Open, he really had not been able to play very much. Played in Basel and Paris-Bercy, where he pulled out with an ab injury, and then, of course, the injury bug stuck with him through the time of the Australian Open, which he had to miss, of course, because of that thigh injury. And I would say, given that he hadn't played for 3 months plus, I would say a pretty productive return. Buenos Aires, really, aside from, a bit of a lapse in the second set against Laszlo Djere, he was pretty much clean as a whistle there, untested, and even up against Cam Norrie, who has seemed to get even better this year again after improving rapidly over the last 2 years. Carlos put in a really convincing display in that Buenos Aires final to dismiss Norrie. In Rio, it was a bit more scratchy throughout the duration of the tournament. But again, through both events, you got the glimpse into what has made his rise over the last couple of years, year and a half, so exciting. You got that special it factor still there. In spades, really. The same type of deal where every match he plays, seemingly, you're gonna see something where you're like, I've never seen something like that before. That is only Carlos Alcaraz. And if it hadn't been for that last half of the Rio final, where, again, that thigh injury seemed to flare up, it already was doing so when he was having it massaged through the semifinal against Yari in Rio, but having it flare up to the point in the final where he really was moving so gingerly, barely moving, really, by the end of the match. In the short term, you really hope that that doesn't derail his ability to play the Sunshine Double. I obviously don't anticipate him playing Acapulco after that. Even injured, he still produced some unbelievable stuff and competed so impressively through the second half of that match in the final against Norrie. The fact that he pushed Cam and extended that match as far as he did, pretty much just being reduced to being a stationary platform, just ball basher throughout the second half of that match, that was really impressive in and of itself. But, in the bigger picture, long term, more importantly, really, you do hope that this isn't the beginning of a pattern of him being injury prone. The guy is such an amazing talent and electric presence for the game. It'd be a damn shame if, to any extent, his body can't keep up with that unreal talent of his. And, honorable mention, Cam Norrie for, also an incredible 2 weeks. The guy didn't even have his best tennis throughout most of those last 2 weeks, but he's just such a physical beast. Can run for days, it seems like, and even in winning ugly this week in Rio, he did deserve to get his hands on some hardware to have something to show for how great he has started 2023. Obviously came out of the gates on fire at United Cup. Couple disappointing results after, and I believe Auckland final, and then early loss in Australia, but he has rebounded beautifully. And then the next thing to address real quick is, of course, Novak Djokovic's return to action in Dubai this week. I'm recording this video after he pulled out the win just edging out Thomas Mahac in his first action again since winning his 10th Australian Open. The bigger story here, of course, is Djokovic passing up Steffi Graf for most weeks at number one now among any singles player ever, period. But to me, I think the bigger magnifying glass should be on the fact that he has, again, relaunched another stint at number one. The way that he has, made up so much ground in so little time, mainly between the indoor swing, also, of course, Wimbledon, but between the indoor swing and winning the Australian Open this year to reclaim that number one spot, I do think that should be the bigger story here. I feel like that was a nice target for Djokovic to have with Graf's 377 weeks, but I don't really see it as like an apples to apples comparison. Not to diminish one or the other, I'm just saying that we've never done it like that. When Federer had the record prior, we never heard mention of Graf's weeks at number one. Very impressive that Djokovic was able to cross that mark, and he very well may go on to have 400 plus weeks at number one when all is said and done. But it feels like he already has gone above and beyond the really meaningful target for him, which was to get past Roger Federer's weeks at number one record, which he did back in 2021. Again, I just don't see it as an apples-to-apples comparison to, require it out of Novak to pass her up. Simply by needing to win, drastically more sets to win a Grand Slam and other differing conditions, they're damn near different sports. To be comparing these records and lumping them together, it just doesn't make sense to me. And quite frankly, ever since Djokovic returned to number one, people setting this mark for him, and even today now, some people bringing up wheelchair weeks at number one or doubles weeks at number one. Even Pam Shriver, who commentates on Tennis Channel and ESPN, whether the intent is to put down what Novak has done or not, bringing up that Graf probably spent a greater percentage of her career ranked at number one than Djokovic did. All of that to me is nonsense and irrelevant. Especially when I feel like I have heard Graf's record weeks at number one more within the context of Djokovic creeping up on 378 than I ever have in the context of the women's tennis GOAT debate. Especially when this is coming from an ESPN pundit that I've heard over the years. Her and just about the rest of the ESPN cast throughout the last couple of years of Serena's career really were framing that debate as the undisputed GOAT for Serena. And I never heard that Graf had a sizable lead over Serena in weeks at number one. And to me, that is the more apples-to-apples context for that record to be used. Yet, over the last couple of weeks, it seemed like we've heard about Steffi's record more than we ever had. And that is the exact thing that kind of just adds fuel to the fire to the notion that a lot of Djokovic fans hold, where, they feel like the media is just out to get him. And, admittedly myself, I've watched on the sidelines of that debate many a time and felt like certain fans were taking it a bit over the top, but I certainly understand where that sentiment comes from. It's stuff like this, being taken out of context, painted in a poor light on several occasions. But anyways, it's ridiculous that he has gotten to such a mark at 378 weeks and counting. You can't argue against the fact that the ranking yet again reflects who the best player in the world is at this moment, and he absolutely deserves to be celebrated for it. And then, of course, the last thing I wanted to do in this video was just highlight a couple of players that I felt were trending upwards, trending downwards over this last month, whether it was indoor hardcourt, clay, whatever the case may be, but really no bigger one to highlight than Daniil Medvedev. It had been well documented, his struggles since losing the Australian Open final a year ago. Initially had some problems with his health. Obviously, the confidence looked shaken, and his play just did not resemble the player that we had come to know for the second half of 2019 through 2021. And just speaking for me, at the end of last year, I still felt that Medvedev would bounce back in 2023. If you watched my 2022 wrap-up and 2023 top 10 prediction video, I still had Medvedev ending this year number 4. But admittedly, I'm not here to take my victory lap after that disappointing, I think, and convincing loss to Djokovic in Adelaide, and then even more concerning, the early exit in Australia at the hands of, in all fairness, a peaking Sebastian Korda, but definitely a really disappointing loss nonetheless. That genuinely had me, and I think a lot of others, questioning whether maybe Daniil Medvedev had already peaked. Seemed like he had a lot of soul-searching to do, falling out of the top 10, and it really was very weird to see him at that position in the rankings given the better part of the last 3 years. However, it really did not take that long for him to return. In fact, as we speak right now, he is on course to return to the top 5, and he is absolutely on a roll. Back-to-back titles in Rotterdam as well as Doha. And now adding this part in post, I am adding it in after he defeated Novak Djokovic in the semis of Dubai, so certainly looks to be on course for back-to-back-to-back titles. Heavy favorite heading into the final against Rublev tomorrow, and coming off the heels of perhaps his most impressive victory since the 2021 US Open final. And of course, all the titles and, the top 10 drought being a thing of the past now, there seem to be very little doubts about Medvedev being back, but also visually, over the last month, he has looked like peak Medvedev. The wall is back, he is looking as impenetrable as ever, and the match that really stamped it for me was the Rotterdam final, the first of his titles, but that final against Jannik Sinner looked so familiar. In spite of the lopsided last 2 sets, Jannik really did put in a spirited effort. But the plot of that match just looked so familiar and so much like peak Medvedev. Lung buster of a first set, and even in spite of losing it, you could see exactly what was coming a mile away. He was just working away Jannik Sinner's legs, and he has continued, making several others look helpless in a very familiar way again. The wall is back, the intent is back. When facing adversity in these matches, contrary to how he had been the prior year, he's not backing into a shell of constant passivity, and overall I've seen enough. Daniil Medvedev is most definitely back. So of the players on an upswing, I think Daniil Medvedev definitely is the biggest to note. Among other winners of February, I think Andy Murray also definitely deserves to be there. Andy so far in 2023, quite the flair for the dramatics to say the least. His Australian Open heroics were already enough drama for a full year, and then his very next tournament, more of the exact same. We've now had 6 Andy Murray victories so far this year, and all 6 of them have been in deciding sets. I believe 3 of them have had to see him save match point or match points. And so he is definitely making good on that promise he made at the beginning of the year that he felt like his fitness was the best it had ever been ever since that hip surgery that has, really changed the course of his career. You would think for a guy 35 years of age and with a metal hip that this way of winning wouldn't be sustainable, but in all honesty, all his matches in Qatar, it really didn't seem like fatigue was playing much of a factor, in spite of the fact that he was playing often marathon matches that were occurring in back-to-back days. Even in that final against Daniil Medvedev, I think Murray put in a good showing for himself, and, he simply lost because Daniil Medvedev's been on a bit of a heater recently, but it's not like he lost because of gassing out or anything like that. And again, a lot of these matches, you saw some of the same stuff that you saw in Australia that was so encouraging. Back to the wall, Murray showed he's, perfectly capable with all the tools in his arsenal of playing more first strike tennis, and in doing so, he scored some excellent wins. Sonego can be tricky. Alexander Zverev, of course, has, looked better and better throughout every passing week. And then Yuri Lehechka, who's had an underratedly great start to 2023. Obviously, it would be nice if Andy could remember how to win matches in straight sets again. Notoriously been a slow starter in all these matches, but on the other hand, it is just a joy to see Murray in his element, smack in the middle of all these battles, getting to showcase his grit and tenacity. That match against Lehechka was, one of the great escapes you will ever see. And ultimately, it would be really nice if he could keep this going, particularly in grass season down the line this year. For Andy Murray so far this year in general, it's onwards and upwards. And then on the flip side, a couple players that really have had a difficult stretch. I think, first and foremost on that list would be Dominic Thiem. It has been super worrying the way that he has started this season, especially if you've been watching the matches. That forehand is just gone at the moment. It's been a consistent theme since Domi's return last year that, that forehand just has not looked the same. And watching him, it has seemed like, there's a bit of hesitancy with going all out on that shot. And I'd say, after such a major wrist injury, that's definitely understandable. But, only he knows if he's not confident or he's scared to hit out on that shot like, it used to be, or if physically he's just unable to. And you really do worry about if that latter situation is the case, because if that's the case, it's hard to see there being a road back. Because without that forehand being anywhere near what it used to be, he looks like a completely altered player, and I do wonder if clay is really magnifying that now, because he did have some good results on indoor hard courts in Vienna and, somewhere else at the end of last year. But if this is the type of player he is now, where, the forehand just is not the same, he can't generate that same type of pace, maybe those types of conditions are ideal for him now, where he can get more help from the court. But through the golden swing, it really sucked to see, because this is the guy that we deemed the Prince of Clay for so long. But on clay, those forehand issues really are being magnified. And in general, when you're getting that little traction out of your forehand, it's just worrying seeing Dominic Thiem seem borderline powerless. I'm also looking at Casper Ruud when it comes to trending downwards right now. He has been very slow out of the gates, and albeit he did not play at all after the Australian Open until Acapulco, but those two matches in Acapulco really were a mess from Casper. Just spraying errors left and right in both those matches against guys that, at least from what I watched, didn't really do much aside from making him play, keeping as many balls in play as possible. And it got ugly at times in those matches. The end of the match against Taro Daniel, which he ultimately ended up losing, he just could not find the court. 2 match points returning at 5-6, and the sequence of 3 points from his second match point in particular, I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, he just straight missed 3 straight makeable returns. And then it was capped off with a really scratchy breaker from both. And at 3-4 on the year so far, I wouldn't say the alarm bells are going off, because, a lot of people did anticipate a hectic back end to Casper Ruud's 2022 carrying over into early 2023, and it would appear that that is the case. Obviously went to the finals of the US Open, took a small break after that, then made the finals of the Tour Finals. And, a lot of people did raise their eyebrows when he and Rafa went on that Latin American exhibition tour. Casper himself, heading into the Australian Open, did indicate that, that was a factor and that he was planning on taking a long break after Australia. But in the limited sample size so far this year, you could argue that he's yet to play a great match this year. I'll give him some leeway on really not having had much time this year to gain much rhythm, but those 2 matches in Acapulco were as bad as I have seen him play in a really long time. And then lastly, of course, I do want to talk about Alexander Zverev. I've been kind of moderate on his comeback. I didn't really set expectations that high. in that same video previewing the top 10 for this year at the end of last year, I left Zverev out of my top 10, and initially I thought he'd be a shoo-in, but after thinking about it, I just didn't think it was reasonable to just hoist those expectations on him where you're expecting him to be, almost all of the player, if not the player he was pre-injury, especially with an injury that, entails that much trauma. It's not often you see that in tennis. And, along those lines, he has come out of 2023 slow. But over the last week, I think there is reason for optimism. He seems to be growing in confidence in his movement by the week. And of course, that is really the main thing to keep an eye out for, given his injury. But other than that, just the fact that a lot of his issues to this point seem like rust, and a lot of the mental yips we've always seen out of him, that being what you notice rather than anything physical, I think that is encouraging. And because of that, I'm inclined to say we might be seeing the outline of a successful comeback. We'll see how he fares tomorrow in Dubai with his first match against a top player since his comeback. And yeah, should be an interesting weekend ahead, but that will do it for this video. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it, and of course, I will see y'all in the next one.